Chapter 1. A great deal of useful information may be gleaned in the first unguarded moment of meeting a new acquaintance, especially when one's face has been disfigured by a werewolf. It is an experiment I have, alas, made nearly every day of my life. Some audibly gasp. Some suffer an inability to look one squarely in the eye. Some hurriedly remember a previous appointment for which they are overdue. On that fateful afternoon 30 years ago, the gray-eyed girl sitting across from me in the dingy parlor of St. Botolph's Hospital for the reception of penitent working girls did none of these things, smelling faintly of soap and orange blossom without even a hint of nervous perspiration. She wore elaborately coiffured golden curls, 3 rows of pearls, and a white dress with Lego mutton sleeves straight out of the fashion plates in Peterson's magazine. She was as precious as a china doll, and about as expressive. Is it true, Sharp, that you've been trained in the gentlemanly sports? The martial arts, you mean? Such of them as are suitable for women, yes, Your Highness. I spoke without thinking, and Miss Scrimson, the hospital's director, shot me a warning look. One did not correct royalty, even royalty as minor as this. I resolved to be more careful. Sometimes it felt as though I had been waiting my entire life to leave St. Botolph's, and I could not do that without Miss Scrimson's approval. I see, the doll-like one said gravely. Then in a dull but decided voice, really, Mama, I cannot imagine what use I could possibly have for such a specialist. Here I must take a moment to introduce Mama. The china doll had spoken stiffly in the first brief silence permitted by the corpulent lady presently wedged into the parlor's most capacious armchair. It should be noted that, although the chair did not fit this lady especially well, the striped silk dress in the latest Parisian mode most certainly did, and the outrageously feathered toque with its 2 wings surmounting the crown reminded one irresistibly of a Valkyrie's winged helm. Age and adipose tissue together had failed to blur the handsomeness of this lady's aristocratic features, to repress the laughing intelligence of her eye, or to encumber her curiously elegant and graceful movements. I liked her immediately. Nonsense, the Valkyrie trumpeted at once. My daughter Miss Scrimson is soon to be elevated to an eminence in society. She will find her place on the stage of the world. Mama, the china doll said, stiff and cold and instantly quelling. I do wish you wouldn't. My dear girl, I will not have you blown to pieces by anarchists as happened to the poor dear Russian emperor. I am hardly likely to attract any such attention. I only think, my dear, that since it is high time you were provided with your own lady's maid, it ought to be someone from St. Botolph's. All the family engages their ladies' maids from St. Botolph's. The director, who had hitherto busied herself pouring cups of tea, took her cue. Not only is it true that St. Botolph's girls serve the royal family, ma'am, but we have sent girls abroad to serve the royalties of Copenhagen, Berlin, Athens, and even St. Petersburg. Our girls are steady young women, perhaps not as respectable as they should be, but they are trained to be loyal and discreet, and they have been carefully instructed to fence, shoot, wrestle, and do excellent plain or fancy needlework. The china doll displayed a languid interest. Do you really wrestle, Sharp? In the Japanese style, yes. I would be happy to give a demonstration. Oh, Miss Scrimson interjected. I cannot think that Her Highness. I should very much like to see it. It really is not a fitting sight for a lady of. Oh, Scrimson, have you no sense of adventure? Cried the Valkyrie, shooting out of the armchair with a pop. Lead on, Miss Keene, wasn't it? Sharp, Your Grace. Elizabeth Sharp. That's what I said. Well, what are you waiting for? I was loath to antagonize Miss Scrimson, for she ruled St. Botolph's with an iron fist, sensitive to any mutiny in the ranks, and I was eager to receive my discharge papers as soon as possible. Nevertheless, both the exalted ladies had now risen to their feet, and waited expectantly to be shown some wrestling. Miss Scrimson lifted despairing hands and nodded to me. Hiding a smile, I turned and threw open the door, leading the way through the rather ugly whitewashed hallway beyond, past the dining room and into the small gymnasium, where the sound of clashing steel told me that a couple of my fellow inmates were hard at work with the foils. As I entered, the 2 occupants turned toward me, their bout forgotten. Liz. Hannah Bunker pulled off her mesh face guard to reveal a dripping smile. How did you do? Have they engaged you? Sal Tanner gave a warning cough as the 2 ladies and Miss Scrimson followed. me into the gymnasium. As the director showed the ladies to seats, I excused myself and followed the two other girls into the dressing room that adjoined the gymnasium. Who are they? Hannah burst out as soon as the communicating door had closed behind us. Those frocks. Is something wrong? Sal added cautiously. As a rule, prospective employers did not visit the gymnasium. They are the Duchess of Tech and her daughter. That's Princess May? Hannah clasped her hands. She is so very handsome. They wanted to see me wrestle. Sal let out a soft snort. Just as though we were tigers at the zoo, I suppose. Please, Sal. You know how much it would mean to me. Sal was too kind to resist for long, but she laid a hand on my arm, drawing me apart and lowering her voice so that Hannah could no longer hear. Do you really wish for this position, Liz? Think. Can you live a lie like this? How would it be a lie? My scars are on my face and will always mark me for what I am. You may be able to find some other means of support, but if I fail to secure this position, how will I live? You said you wanted the truth. Want it? I crave it as a desert craves water, but what chance do I have of finding any truth at St. Botolph's? I want to know who I really am and how. I got these scars. If I take service with these people, I can begin my search. At last. You will have to conceal it from them, Liz, Sal said, shaking her head. They may not be monsters like the one who gave you your scars, but they will rule your life, and if you betray your real purpose, they will throw you into the gutter from which they suppose you came. If you think that will frighten me out of my decision, you are much mistaken. Sal gave me a melancholy smile. Well, if nothing short of grievous bodily harm will stop you. And it won't, I assured her. Then I will just have to smite you hip and thigh and lay you up for the next month. You're a good sort, Sal. During our conversation, I divested myself of dress, petticoats, and corset. Now, like Sal, I wore something rather like a set of cycling bloomers with a soft broadcloth jacket belted over the top, both made in a rather faded blue gray that I liked since it flattered my complexion. Returning to the gymnasium, Sal and I took up our positions before the exalted onlookers. The wrestling taught at St. Botolph's was called the gentle art by Miss Nakamura, our teacher. In a sense, I understood why it was called this, for it was all about using one's opponent's own weight and impetus against him. The name must have fooled the board of directors, for although it was an art well adapted to use against a larger and more powerful opponent, and thus helpful for any young woman who might find herself obliged to put a chokehold on a brawny young anarchist, it was not particularly gentle either, in its use or in its effects. These days, of course, the doctors no longer advise young ladies that their internal organs will be fatally damaged by too great an exertion, but 30 years ago there was a great deal of concern on that point, and as inmates of St. Botolph's we were forced to conclude that our health was not a primary consideration to our guardians. Nevertheless, if you ask me, those rough and tumble bouts of my youth merely contributed to the excellent health I enjoy today. My husband says I am made of cast iron, and my children, who have had the opportunity to try them, will tell you that there is nothing whatever the matter with my internal organs. Marriage and children were still some way off in my future on that afternoon. Sal and I approached each other warily. I snatched at the front of her jacket, seeking a firm hold. She parried my reaching hands, then reached over to grab a handful of my shoulder seam, giving me the chance to latch onto her collar. At the front, as we circled, our feet slapping loudly against the floor, Sal relinquished her hold to grab at the back of my neck. Ducking slightly, I evaded her grasp. She reached for my shoulder again and I had my chance. Quick as thought, I pulled her to the floor, scissoring her legs in mine, using our impetus to roll out from beneath and get on top of her. A frantic moment later, and I had her pinned between my knees and elbows. Princess May gasped, and the Duchess uttered a melodious shriek. Miss Scrimson leaned forward and said, "Now then, Sharp, that will do." As Sal picked herself up off the floor, the princess leaned forward an inch or so. "Are you much hurt?" Her voice was calm, but a bright spot burned high on her cheekbone. "Not likely," Sal replied. It was true, too, of all the girls at St. Botolph's, Sal was our only vampire victim. As a result, she was even more durable than the rest of us. Stronger, too. Had she been in earnest, she would have beaten me. We're all monster food here, ma'am. Those of us it doesn't kill, it makes stronger. Faster. Miss Scrimson glared daggers at Sal, and I choked on a laugh. One did not refer to werewolves, vampires, or sirens as monsters. Most especially one. Did not refer to their dietary habits. Certainly not in front of royalty. However minor. The princess took a deep breath. Is it true what they say that if you have been attacked by one of them, you become one of them? Sal looked at me and I looked at Sal. Neither of us trusted ourselves to reply. There was a reason why my scars made me unfit for any but the very highest or the very lowest of society. Most people presumed I had the scars by choice, that I must be the sort of girl who would sell her body and blood for easy money. And it wasn't a long stretch from that to assuming that I would eventually sprout fangs and claws of my own in the gutters of Whitechapel. However, they know that sometimes bad things happen to good girls, and no matter how desperate your choices, they don't expect you to transform into a monster at the full of the moon. In the corridors of Whitehall too they know better, and for a moment I wondered if the princess was mocking us. Wherever did you hear that, my dear? The Duchess boomed, breaking the tense silence. Nonsense. If just anyone could become a werewolf, your papa would be King of Württemberg. If you say so, Mama. I do wonder if we should engage her, though, the Duchess continued meditatively. The scars are unfortunate. I should hate the servants to be impertinent to her. Oh, I think she would be more than capable of dealing with that sort of trouble, the princess said, turning slightly pink and looking more like a China doll than ever. Wouldn't you, Sharp? This time I couldn't repress a laugh. I'm perfectly able to shoot, stab, or strangle any number of saucy footmen, ma'am. The question is, have I your leave to do so? Sharp, Miss Scrimson rebuked, but the Duchess only laughed. I give you leave to maim one, and if anyone interferes with you after that, on his own head be it. With that, everything seemed to be arranged, while the Duchess arranged with Miss Scrimson for myself and my luggage to be forwarded to the White Lodge, Richmond. The princess approached me. Are you from the continent, Sharp? The Dickens. I thought I had managed to eradicate the last faint traces of an accent from my voice. England is all I have ever known. She nodded, but her next question was no easier to answer. Where did you get your scars? I watched her closely. Too bold for a lady's maid perhaps, but I wanted to see how she responded. I don't know, ma'am. I have no memory of that dreadful night. She looked away, as though she didn't much care for my scrutiny, or as though she'd suddenly recalled that her own station in life kept her from being in terms of easy familiarity with such as me. Perhaps that is for the best. Shall expect you tomorrow at noon. Chapter 2. I had no memory of that dreadful night, nor of anything before it. I may take it as a matter of faith that I must have been born of woman in the ordinary way, that I must have had a childhood, a girlhood, a first love, but I will never regain those memories. Although England was all I had ever known, I had certainly been raised somewhere else. There had always been something not quite English about me in ways that went beyond my accent. The weather bothered me, the manners puzzled me, even the drinking water tasted flat and stale to me. Miss Scrimson was fond of insinuating that this was because in my former life I had been a gutter snipe, incapable of appreciating the finer things. I did not believe her. As for Elizabeth Sharp, her story began on a cold, clear winter's night at the beginning of 18, when a full moon hovered above the London streets, filling the Thames with silver, and frost rimed the gutters with ice like diamonds. All they told me at St. Botolph's was that I was carried to the hospital, bleeding from claw and tooth marks. My clothes contained no hint to my true name or identity, and being full of vermin, they were burned before I woke. Was assigned a name suitable to my position in life, and when at length I recovered from that brutal attack, I was transferred to the hospital's reformatory to be trained as a bodyguard cum lady's maid. Questions were frowned upon at St. Botolph's, and we quickly learned not to ask them. Still, from the very beginning I had a notion that the quiet and thoughtful Saltaner could be trusted. Don't you think it strange that none of us have any memory of our life before St. Botolph's? I asked her one Sunday afternoon as we returned from church, but she didn't answer. How do we know that we really are penitent working girls? I asked one evening as we sat in the common room practicing our embroidery. If we'd really been prostitutes, wouldn't they be examining the rest of us for diseases the way Jemima said they did her cousin? Jemima was the housemaid. Why are they training us to protect royalty when we all know they're the monsters who attacked us in the first place? I asked one morning as we worked. together to defuse a bomb in the quadrangle. At that, Sal had shot me a level stare. If they catch you asking all these questions, Liz, they'll make you disappear properly. So you have been thinking about it. She put down her oxyacetylene torch with a sigh. Go on. Well, doesn't it make you wonder? What good does it do us to have the only royal family in Europe that aren't monsters if they're going to let Russian vampires and German werewolves and goodness knows what else come to London and feed on British subjects? It's not a bad question. None of them are bad questions, but nobody wants to talk about it. Sal picked up her torch and once again methodically tackled the dummy bomb. No, she said deliberately. I don't want to talk about it. I'd rather do something about it. From that date our friendship began. Sal had already begun to gather any information she could on the monsters. Their abilities, their weaknesses, their times of power. I was not the only one of the St. Botolph's girls who had questions. At St. Botolph's they taught us to protect the monsters, not how to defeat them. Late at night, after the lights were out and the others were asleep, we gathered in a huddle of blankets in the frigid breezes below the open dormitory window to exchange the bits of gossip we had gleaned during the day from teachers, servants, milkmen, or in Sal's case from the books she read at the public library in the Whitechapel Road. Little by little our knowledge grew, and while St. Botolph's taught us to counteract the terror of radical anarchists, we prepared ourselves to face the terror of titled monsters. As I sat in Miss Scrimson's carbolic soap-scented office the morning after my introduction to the Duchess of Teck and her daughter, I felt almost intoxicated with the promise of freedom and the terrifying prospect that soon I might put my hard-earned knowledge to the test. You may be unaware, Miss Scrimson said, giving me a hard look over the top of her steel-rimmed spectacles, that an engagement is daily expected between Princess May and Prince Albert Victor of Clarence. That jolted me out of my memories. Prince Albert Victor? The Prince of Wales' son. The same. Well, stone the crows. Prince Albert Victor was a beautiful golden-haired young man whose dapper form and darling mustaches caused a stir among the girls every time a newspaper or society column found its way into the hospital. As the second in line to the throne, he was a fabulous catch, and the newspapers had linked his name with half the eligible princesses in Europe. Baser gossip also hinted at liaisons with society ladies and a tawdry appetite for laundresses, but no one was likely to throw a bomb at any of them. My position with May of Teck was far more serious a thing than I had imagined. Evidently Miss Scrimson was of the same opinion. Should you continue in her Highness service, you may in time find yourself acting as the personal lady's maid and bodyguard to the Princess of Wales, and in time the Queen of England. It cannot be too strongly urged that as the guardian of a royal personage, you are in some sort the guardian of order itself. Should you fail in your task, you fail civilization itself and give rein to the forces of chaos and bloodshed. Of course, she did not mean that bloodshed was really wrong, only that it was wrong when committed by the wrong people. Somewhere out there in the great world which I was about to join, the royal werewolf who had given me my scars lived in freedom and luxury, revered by all. He would never be punished for what he had done, never be prevented from doing the same to other girls. Unless I could find him. The British monarchy is a singular one, Miss Scrimson continued primly. Alone among the great powers, our queen boasts no unnatural abilities. Yet it is likely that as a servant of someone closely connected with the crown you will often find yourself in the environs of royal personages from the continent. I feel confident that you will treat such persons with all the deference due to their station and that of your lady. She cleared her throat, as though about to broach a delicate topic. You will hold a privileged position, but it brings with it certain dangers. It is true that the lupin condition cannot be communicated through bites or scratches, but just as there is a certain alteration in one's strength, sense of smell, ability to see in the dark and so on, so also there may be an alteration in outlook and demeanor. I tried to conceal my surprise. Our keepers had never spoken of this before, and neither had the whispers late at night in the dormitory. I am telling you this only because it is so important for you to be on your guard sharp. The truth is that despite all we can do at St. Botolph's, some in your position suffer from feelings of melancholy, fear, anger, or vengefulness. These constitute an illness of the mind which may suddenly worsen, leading the sufferer to turn against her masters and even to embrace anarchy. Should you find that you struggle with these feelings, it is vital to stop work at once and report to St. Botolph's for strict rest and quiet, before the more vicious mania develops. I repressed a grin. So, some of St. Botolph's girls had become anarchists? Paid no heed, of course, to the insinuation that a desire for revenge might drive me mad. It was only another version of the usual confusion between monster and monster victim. Serve with loyalty and discretion, and you can look forward to a respectable career and a comfortable pension in your old age. But you must know that the people we are privileged to serve can take no risks. Miss Scrimson leaned forward, and the pale winter sun struggling in by the window reflected coldly from her spectacles. Her voice had become harsh and flat. Fail them and they will have no choice but to put you down like a mad dog. A chill ran down my spine, worse than getting into bed on a winter's night. She was perfectly serious, I realized. Abruptly, Miss Scrimson stood, smiling and putting out her hand to be shaken. I congratulate you on finding a position, Sharp. Come back and visit from time to time. It will be very good for the girls to see to what kind of eminence they may rise. In other circumstances I might have agreed with her, for I had many friends at the hospital, but I knew what kind of example she meant to make of me. I must be diligent and deferential, and the model St. Botolph's girl. Thank you, I said, taking her hand. I will certainly return. Yes, I swore I would return, once I had unmasked the monster who had ruined me. Once I could never again be mistaken for the model St. Botolph's girl. The tech carriage was at the door and I had already packed my carpet bag and been issued a sturdy umbrella and a small revolver. Sal, Hannah, and the other girls, about 20 of them, waited in the hall to bid me goodbye. I envy you, Hannah whispered, embracing me. The dresses and the parties and a real chance of seeing some action. But Sal only took my hand and looked at me earnestly. For the truth, she whispered. For the truth, I answered. I climbed into the carriage and began my journey to the White Lodge Inn, Richmond Park. Chapter 3. My journey was more interesting to myself, who then had little experience of the world beyond St. Botolph's, than it would be to the reader who may have been London-born and London-bred. Imagine me, therefore, a rather fresh-faced young woman about 23 years of age in a plain black dress and straw hat with black hair, large innocent eyes and a large innocent mouth that more often than not displays a set of fine even teeth, the whole effect marred by 3 slashing claw marks running from eye to jaw along the left side of the face, leaning out at the carriage window to drink in all the sights of Holborn, Covent Garden, Westminster, and the rest on a clear still day in mid-December. That is all there is to see, and while you observe this picture I will beguile the journey by telling you about the family in which I was going to serve. Princess May's father was a minor German prince, but for a morganatic union, the Duke of Teck would have been the King of Württemberg. His father, however, had married a mere countess, and the countess could not be forgiven, nor her children permitted to inherit. The kings and princes of Germany prided themselves upon the purity of their blood, and gloried in rather than deplored the resulting necessity to spend 5 nights in each month running wild in the game preserve, howling at the moon. To enjoy this doubtful privilege, however, one must be able to trace one's descent to antediluvian times, in an unbroken line of monstrous kings and sanguinary princes. The inclusion of a countess in the bloodline was bound to produce a neutered litter. The children would never sharpen their claws on the granite of Harz, nor chew on unfortunate sight seers in the Tyrolean Alps. Therefore, the Duke's father had been cut out of the line of succession. The sins of the parents had been visited upon the children, and His Serene Highness the Duke of Teck was left to make his way in a world which sneered at him for his disability. His more fortunate Württemberg cousins, I am told, thought it a very pleasant joke to leave severed limbs on his doorstep whenever he happened to be in the kingdom. The Duke's proud and sensitive soul was no less distressed by the question of marriage. Should he marry beneath himself and compound his father's transgression, or should he live and die a bachelor, as his sisters seemed destined to do as old maids? No doubt he was feeling keenly oppressed by this dilemma upon the occasion that he was invited to England to meet Princess Mary Adelaide. Princess Mary Adelaide, at the time of her marriage, was at once the fattest, the unruliest, and the most universally beloved member of a royal family which, in those days, as I have mentioned, was the only monarchy in Europe that boasted of its inability to transform into bloodthirsty hellhounds or some such thing on the night of the full moon. Her marriage to the Duke of Teck thus neatly solved the problem of her advancing unmanageable spinsterhood on the one hand, and brought him into perhaps the only royal family in Europe, broad-minded enough to overlook his humble origins on the other. The match was pleasing to both parties. Since that time more than 20 years had passed, during which the Duchess of Teck had only become more corpulent, more unruly and more popular. She carried herself with the self-assurance of an empress, but it was no secret that Princess May had inherited not only her father's elegant figure, but also his dilemma: too royal to marry a commoner, not monstrous enough to match with royalty, and too poor, for thanks to her mother's extravagances the family had barely any money, to embrace a virtuous spinsterhood. From Miss Scrimson and the society papers I had a dim idea of these things, and as city gave way to countryside and the carriage rolled through the wintry sweep of Richmond Park, I amused myself by wondering how it came about that the obscure and impoverished offspring of a morganatic German prince should acquire as a suitor the heir to the throne of the greatest empire in the world. It was, after all, barely half a year since the bookkeepers had laid long odds on Prince Albert Edward marrying a French princess. Between the gate to the lodge's grounds and the imposing steps that led up to the neat Georgian facade of the house with its columns and pediment, I invented half a dozen very plausible explanations. As it turned out, all of them were quite mistaken, without even the virtue of preparing me for the shocking truth. But I am getting ahead of my story. The carriage halted at the front of the house, and the coachman handed down my bag with a wink. I returned a grateful smile, for the Duchess's words about impertinent footmen had worried me a little, before hurrying up the stairs to knock at the door. This was opened by a butler who stiffened fractionally at the sight of my scars. I ignored it, bobbing a slight curtsy by way of establishing my docile and deferential character. "Good day, sir. I've come to be the new lady's maid." The butler remained chilly. "Your name?" "Elizabeth Sharp." I was told to expect a Miss Smart. Evidently I had come to the correct house. "It's most certainly Sharp, sir." The butler looked past me to the frosty day and empty drive, made a wordless sound indicative of both skepticism and resignation, and stood back to let me enter. From the outside the house seemed compact, within it seemed cramped. The entrance hall ran the breadth of the front of the house and was decorated with brocaded wallpaper, stags' heads, family portraits, whatnots, cabinets, occasional tables, armchairs, potted plants, vases, figurines, lamps, stools, shawls, rugs, and one lugubrious aspidistra. Straight ahead in the dark bowels of the house, a rather fine staircase could be glimpsed leading to the upper story, but apart from that the overwhelming impression was one of walls and ceilings, abrupt windows and closed doors. "Wait here and I'll speak to her grace," the butler instructed, disappearing into the aforesaid bowels. I unpinned my hat and looked about me with relish. As cramped and inconvenient as such a house must be, there was something pleasant and reassuring in this empire of tiny things. In these riotous eruptions of miniature tables and indoor ferns was a sense of coziness and comfort which I had never known in the stark whitewashed halls of St. Botolph's, and I could see that whoever had been in charge of the arrangements had used excellent taste. I had explored no more than a half-dozen small tables and an inlaid cabinet, when I became aware that the Duchess was approaching in a flurry of footsteps that began some way off and advanced rapidly through the house in a series of slamming doors and creaking floorboards. At last a nearby door flew open and she emerged ahead of the butler, rather breathless, in a brocaded dressing gown, nearly the same color as the wallpaper. "Ah, Sharp. It is you. I can't think why Chips was trying to frighten me with tales of an impostor. You're just in time, my dear. May wanted you to bring the tea out to the garden as soon as you arrived. You can settle in once you've seen to that." The door slammed again, and the sound of the Duchess progressing back through the house was heard. I looked up at the butler and said, "Mr. Chips? Is that really your name?" "Yes," he said with a sigh. "Her Grace is rarely incorrect when it comes to me." He led me down a cramped staircase to a narrow servants' hall, where the footman, cook, and housemaid stopped talking and stared for as long as it took me to nudge my carpet-bag, umbrella and hat into a corner, tie a white apron over my dress and lift the massive tea tray. It wasn't the sort of work a lady's maid was supposed to do, but then I was no ordinary lady's maid. Thankfully, for the tray was heavy. Following Mr. Chip's directions, I made my way through the dark downstairs and up 3 steps into the garden. It was, as I have said, a sunny day and, despite the winter chill, the air was clear and still. The garden had been turned into a wilderness of lilacs and syringas, and in the sun at the far end of the lawn 2 gentlemen were watching Princess May shooting arrows at a target with methodical accuracy. The sun glinted in her perfectly coiffed hair and her dove-gray morning dress, and a wistful sigh escaped me. What a picture of contentment! What a charmed life! Miss Scrimson's instructions that morning seemed for the first time to serve some purpose. This was order and civilization, and all good things if anything was. A little way behind the princess, a table with 3 chairs had been set up in the sun. One slim floral-scented gentleman was lounging in one of the chairs. His legs were stretched out, and he was pulling discontentedly at his mustache. A second, stouter gentleman stood near Princess May, and as I approached I noticed with surprise that he had put one hand on her hip and was using the other to adjust her aim, giving a stream of instructions in guttural German as he did so. "Thank you, Ernst, but I think I can manage," the princess replied coolly in English. Having readjusted her aim in defiance of his instructions, she hit the target again. I placed the tea tray on the table and straightened, proud of having neither spilled a drop of tea nor upset the tower of seed cake. When I looked up I realized with some shock that the floral-scented gentleman at the table must be Prince Albert Edward. He was just as exquisitely beautiful as the newspaper sketches had suggested, but in person he seemed rather slighter and more fragile. His waving brown hair had begun to recede a little, his complexion was as pale as a girl's, his neck was long and swan-like, and in his large, doe-like eyes, now petulantly regarding his German rival, there was neither wit nor fire. In fact, he reminded me of nothing so much as a gorgeous, graceful and delicate bird. The 3 of them paid more attention to the tea tray than they did to me. "Have you finished shooting, May?" asked the beautiful prince, sitting up a little straighter as she turned toward us. "Ah yes, May. I must not keep you all to myself. You must bestow a little smile on poor collars and cuffs," cried the German, throwing himself into a chair. He reached over for a piece of seed cake, throwing me a casual glance. As he did so, he saw my scars and his eyebrows lifted. Prince Albert Edward pouted. "Collars and cuffs. I wish you would not call me that. That is what Papa calls me. I cannot abide being called that. And I don't call you that, Eddie dear. Have some seed cake. I'll return directly. Oh, sharp. A word." The princess took my elbow and steered me back towards the house, stopping when we were just out of earshot to glance over her shoulder at the 2 gentlemen. With almost imperceptible agitation, she began to pull off her shooting gloves, but not even the off-kilter mood of the afternoon could have prepared me for her next words. "I'm so glad you're here, Sharp. Do tell me, how do I get rid of a werewolf?" Chapter 4. How shall I describe the thrill of horror that went through me at her words? Werewolf. Fragments of memory assailed me. Sulphurous yellow eyes tearing. Pain, the musky scent of the wild beast, things that had haunted my nightmares since I awoke in St. Botolph's. A dreadful chill ran through every limb and the hair started up on my head. A werewolf. I was shocked by my own terror. Of course, I had hoped that my position would bring me into the environs of continental royalties. Of course, that was a large part of the reason I had accepted it. But this was only the second werewolf I had ever had the misfortune to meet. I had been promised nothing more dreadful than the occasional bomb, and in that first ghastly moment I turned coward, and wished most devoutly for the bombs. "A werewolf," I said faintly. "Do you mean that gentleman is the brother of the German Empress, and he has been perfectly beastly to Eddie all morning?" Princess May pulled off her second shooting glove and slapped it into her left palm with unnecessary force, as though she would have liked to repeat the operation with the German prince's face. "How is Eddie to propose to me, if Ernst Gunther will keep hanging about being cruel to him?" The night lessons at St. Botolph's flooded back to me. Ere we might shoot him with a silver bullet, ma'am, or drop wolfsbane in his tea. Wolfsbane. Would that be safe? Safe, oh. My shock must have destroyed the power of thought. Of course then, English princess could not murder a royal suitor at tea in her garden, no matter how monstrous. I must keep my wits about me. I beg your pardon, your highness. They didn't teach me much about werewolves at St. Botolph's. What did you learn? Oh, defusing bombs, picking locks, basic shift ciphers, a little French and German and fine needlework, that sort of thing. I don't see why they couldn't have taught you a little about werewolves. I've never met an anarchist, but all my German cousins are werewolves, and it would be so nice sometimes to give them just a little fright. Very well, it can't be helped. You might as well go in and have Mrs. Leacock show you to your room. As she turned back to the table, the German overset the milk jug with a clatter. May, he called, jumping up. You must have your girl bring more milk. I have spilled it all. Resigned, I accompanied May to the table and took the milk jug. I scrutinized Ernst Gunther as I did so. He was a rather beefy, stupid-looking young man, some years older than May and myself, with a neatly trimmed imperial beard and a bad haircut that looked as though it had been cut with the assistance of a shallow bowl. He smiled at me, not very pleasantly, and said, Are your brothers at home, May? I'm afraid not. Dolly and Frank are with their regiments, and all just at school. What a shame. I had hoped to pay my respects. But Papa is in his library and would be delighted to receive you, she added, quickly seizing the opportunity. Sharp will show you to the house if you wish. Splendid, he returned, and with a little military click of his heels he bowed very formally first to May and then to Eddie. As we crossed the lawn together, Ernst Gunther added, It is very good of you to show me the way. Miss? There was something insinuating in his voice, which I neither liked nor trusted. Sharp, your highness. Call me Ernst. I would not dare, sir, I said in the most prim and quelling tone of which I was capable. As we approached the house, I hesitated. I did not know where to find the Duke of Tech's library, and if I took Ernst Gunther up the exterior steps to the French doors I could see on this side of the house, I might disturb one of the family. Very well, I would take him in by the downstairs entrance and hand him over to another of the servants in the kitchen, and then, at least I would be rid of him. This way, if you please. I led the way down the steps to the door through which I had come. I had taken 3 steps through the cool flagstoned passage when I found myself seized and pinned against the wall. Now then, Sharp, Ernst Gunther said breathlessly. Be a good kind girl and give me a kiss. What the dickens? I said shakily, and as he lunged for my mouth I turned quickly away, and he bumped his forehead against the wall. Don't be coy, my dainty, he said. It will be full moon in another night or 2 and I'll need to drink. What's the price for a feed? I'll pay whatever you charged your last buyer. Since my attack I had had an unusually developed sense of smell, and at present Ernst's emotions were pouring off him. Lust and hunger and excitement. Mingled among them I could scent my own. Curiously, I was not afraid. My moment of fear had come in the garden minutes ago. Presently all I felt was a strange exhilaration. I had waited 2 years for this moment. Are you hungry, Ernst? I drew back my lips, showing my teeth in a snarl. How hungry do you think I am? And with a growl I lunged for his throat. Whatever he had expected, it was not this, and part of him must have believed in the stories that said his monstrous condition was contagious, just as Miss Scrimson did. He flinched away from me with an inarticulate yelp of terror. Thus freed, I took a step forward, placing my right foot behind his left heel, and threw him over my hip. He fell heavily and I knelt, grasping him by the throat. Although my attack had left me with greatly augmented strength, as a full-blooded monster his would still be superior to mine, and I must press my advantage while he was still frightened and disoriented. Finding the pulse points on his neck, I applied gentle pressure. On a January night 2 years ago my face was ripped open by a werewolf. Was it you, Ernst Gunther? Were you in London then? Before he could reply, the kitchen door opened and I looked up into the horrified eyes of the cook, the valet, the housekeeper, 2 housemaids and Mr. Chips. Miss Sharp, the butler protested. That was too bad. I had had hopes of the servants seeing me as a friend, and not a monster, but it could not be helped now. I let go of Ernst Gunther and straightened, wiping my hands disdainfully on my apron. The movement reminded me of the milk jug, and I extracted it from the pocket. I'm afraid his Highness was clumsy enough to spill the milk, Mr. Chips. The servants jostled to make way as I advanced towards the kitchen. Behind me, Ernst Gunther scrambled to his feet with a stream of German words I had never been taught. You savage, he sputtered at last. Mark my words, woman. The Duchess shall hear of this. With copious apologies, Mr. Chips led the prince away. In the kitchen the other servants hardly moved or spoke, and then a little tweenie with a freckled face and a broad Cockney accent cried out, "All that for spilling the milk? What would you have done if he'd broken a teacup, Miss Sharp?" That seemed to bring home the absurdity of it all, and I smiled at her gratefully. "Be about your business, Molly," the housekeeper warned. An awkward silence fell. I glanced toward my carpet bag, wondering gloomily if I would have the chance to unpack it. Upstairs doors slammed, floorboards groaned, and I heard Prince Ernst Gunther's clipped German voice rising in indignation. "Monster," he shouted. The front door slammed and the sound of a retreating carriage could be heard. A moment after, the bell rang in the green corridor. "You'd best come with me, Miss Sharp." The housekeeper's tone prophesied doom. As I followed her upstairs, I tried not to care, but it was no use. Miss Scrimson had called this position a privileged one, and I felt that it was. So, how many young women of my sort had the chance to live their lives in a house so full of beautiful and comfortable things? How many could rely on regular food, decent pay, and the guarantee of a bed each night? I felt keenly aware that my feet stood on the brink of a precipice, over which I might slip at any moment and tumble down to the gutter to starvation and deprivation and the loss of whatever honor remained to me. Yet what else could I have done better than allow such as Prince Ernst Gunther to drink my blood? With such gloomy thoughts to occupy me, I was glad to find that the journey to the green corridor was a brief one. During the short time I had spent in the garden, I had seen that the White Lodge had, at some date, been added on to by an architect of more originality than practicality. 2 low wings had been built, each slightly further from the original building than seemed pleasant or convenient, and each of these was joined to the main part of the house by a long curving corridor. Each corridor was furnished with a wide, shallow nook, something like a bay window, and in one of these the Duchess of Teck transacted her business. We found her there in a large, velvet-upholstered chair next to a fireplace, amidst a welter of portraits, mirrors, candlesticks, cushions, carpets, plants, and the ubiquitous tables. In addition to these native furnishings were dozens of brown paper parcels and large heaps of what appeared to be laundry, but were, I later learned, charitable donations. I pitied anyone having to pick their way through this maze in a hurry or in the dark. "Oh, Sharp," said the Duchess, folding a letter which she had been perusing. Couldn't help but notice that this time, she got my name right. Just who I wanted to see. "Thank you, Mrs. Leacock." "But, ma'am." "Oh, don't make a fuss, Mrs. Leacock. I don't expect her to bite me. Come to think of it, do you mean to bite me, Sharp?" "Not at all, Your Grace. I fear you would be more than I could chew," I replied without thinking. The housekeeper's eyes nearly started out of her head. The Duchess looked at me with sheer delight, which at a look from Mrs. Leacock, she transformed into a cough. "Now then, Sharp, this sort of thing will never do. I will not be made merry of in my own house, nor will I have my guests bitten. It's most improper. Thank you, Mrs. Leacock, you may go. As for you, Sharp," she added, as Mrs. Leacock withdrew, "what is the meaning of all this? The Duke of Schleswig-Holstein tells me you nearly tore his throat out." I hesitated. It was my word against his, and I was not sure to what extent, if any princess might back me up. I glanced through the window in the alcove, and was rewarded with the sight of the handsome princess and the beautiful prince sitting tete-a-tete at the tea-table. No, at present I could not ask for her help, even if I could be sure she would give it. I believe His Grace made an honest mistake. He appeared to be under the impression that I would sell him some of my blood. Ah, of course he did. But it puts us in a very awkward position, Sharp. The Germans are so touchy. If he chooses to complain about this to the Kaiser, I don't know what might happen. You believe me, then? Oh, that odious man. I cannot tell what May was thinking sending him off with you alone. He is quite notorious. But really, Sharp, you ought to have been more discreet. A footman is one thing, but a duke is another. Your face cannot be helped, and it is likely you will have more of the same trouble from Time to time. Could you not have put him off more gently? Not without letting him kiss me. The Duchess frowned and I clasped my hands. In something close to despair. Whatever my face may say of me, I am an honest woman. I believe that I always was. I may have lost the appearance of respectability, but I retain the truth, and am I now to surrender that truth to the first man who demands it of me, merely because he is someone and I am nobody? Would you wish to have such a woman about your daughter? No, indeed. Still, upon seeing your face, I feared some such trouble. And May will always have such men as that wretched Ernst Gunther about her. So much the better, if she has me about her also. You did say you thought one maiming would suffice. So I did. Well, Sharp, for now you may stay. But next time I shall expect you to temper the wind to the shorn lamb, so to speak. Glancing through the alcove window, the Duchess rose lightly to her feet. Ah, Eddie is leaving. Thank you, Sharp. Thank you, ma'am, I said with feeling. The Duchess shot me an imperious glance. Don't thank me, girl. I make my domestic arrangements for my daughter's good, not for yours. Now run along and ask Mrs. Peacock to show you to your room. And from the malapropism, I deduced that all was well, and the sun was shining on me once more. Chapter 5. Mrs. Leacock showed me to my room, a cramped affair in the upper level of one of the wings. As a lady's maid, I had the small chamber to myself. Contained a narrow bed, a rag rug, a wooden chair, an old-fashioned oil lamp, and a table holding a basin and jug. By comparison to the downstairs apartments used by the family, you might think it neither cozy nor luxurious. But then you have never had to live at St. Botolph's in a dormitory with 10 other girls, and only a grimy view of the rooftops to be seen through the window. It was chilly, but all the rooms were chilly in those days. I was very pleased with it. I had hoped that Princess May might have brought Eddie to the point of proposing that afternoon, if only to distract the household from the unwomanly vehemence of my objections to the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein. But she did not, and I resigned myself to being a 9-days wonder. Happily, Molly the tweenie found me rather fascinating than terrifying, and the cook, Mrs. Blackmore, was eager to impress me with her collection of scandalous stories about Ernst Gunther. The three of us were getting on famously by the time Mr. Chips rang the gong and I ventured upstairs to prepare Princess May for dinner. The princess was already in her bedroom when I entered, brushing her hair languidly before the mirror. Oh, Sharp, I'm afraid you must have been scolded horribly this afternoon. I wouldn't call it a scolding, ma'am. No? I think Mama likes you. She sat back watching me in the mirror as I set to work on her hair. I must apologize to you, Sharp. I misjudged you. How so, ma'am? I asked Mrs. Leacock to repeat to me what you said to the servants about Ernst Gunther. You did not mention my name or my request at all. There was no reason I should. All the same, I am grateful for your discretion. I am quite serious, Sharp. Cannot abide gossiping among servants, for then it gets out into the newspapers and one's private matters are pawed over by the whole world. She heaved a sigh. It was all for nothing, though. No doubt she was alluding to Prince Eddie's failure to propose that afternoon. She drummed her fingers briefly on the top of her dressing table, worrying her lower lip with her teeth, and I thought of the slim, sickly, beautiful Prince Eddie. Have you known the Duke of Clarence for very long? Oh yes, since we were children. We used to slide down the staircases at Marlborough House together on tea trays. Dear Eddie, she said and heaved another sigh. Do you love him? If it's not too bold to ask. It is a great deal too bold, she said with asperity. I asked how I should dress her hair, and she gave a few offhand instructions. I worked in silence for a while and then she spoke again. Eddie is very beautiful. I suppose he is. Do you like a man to be prettier than yourself, Sharp? The question has never occurred to me, ma'am. After a silence she went on. I suppose he is warm-hearted at least. He's been in love with everyone. He's a dear boy and I do like him very much. But as Aunt Queen says, he will need a very sensible wife. Aunt Queen, I realized numbly, must be the Queen. The very same exalted personage for whom armies spilled blood all over the globe, had decided views on the marriage of the two young people having tea on the lawn that afternoon. It fairly took one's breath away. I suppose it is thought, then, that you shall be the sensible wife? Poor May. She had answered my former question, though not in so many words. She had declared him in her own reserved way to be silly and fickle and unattractive. Should it suit you to be a queen, do you think? Aunt Queen thinks I would do very well. But what do you think? It hardly matters what I think. I am poor, and I am not as young as I once was. My brothers have their regiments and can draw an income and do something to serve this great empire. But where does that leave me? I am very happy, helping Mama with her guild work and doing good to the poor. But what shall I do when she and Papa are dead? I don't want to die old and lonely in a dark corner of a palace that doesn't belong to me like some I have known. Some of my surprise must have shown on my face, for she added dully, "Is there something wrong with my hair, Sharp?" "No, ma'am. I was only surprised that you thought yourself poor. There is a great deal of debt, I am afraid. Still, I envy you. You have a pleasant home, a family that loves you, and face that doesn't belie you. I would give a great deal to have any of those." And I wondered whether perhaps I too had once lived in such a home with such a family in the days before my face was marked. Yet I am very happy in having enough to eat and a warm bed and work to occupy me. There are some without even that to rely upon. Yes, of course. I think of them often when I think of all the little things I cannot do or buy or look forward to because I have no money. I must always be generous to those less fortunate than I. As I finished her coiffure, she looked into the mirror, turning her head from side to side to inspect the result. "Very good, Sharp. You may lay out my lilac taffeta and volume 3 of the Dutch Republic." I was to learn that a large part of Princess May's erudition was due to the Dutch's congenital tardiness at mealtimes. I extracted the dress from the closet and the book from the shelf, and began to help her on with the former. "That is why I think I should like to be a queen," the princess added, thoughtfully as I did so. "As Eddie's wife, I should be able to do good for the less fortunate. They look to us, to bring a little grandeur, a little romance, and a little happiness into their sad lives. It is due to our protection that they live at peace, and it is due to our example that they may strive to better themselves." I pardoned her for this. Of course I pardoned her, though I did feel it was hard to be instructed in what I and other less fortunate persons should feel for royalties. After all, she knew nothing of the world beneath her own sphere, and her words might have been more convincing to one who did not bear with her a constant reminder of exactly how happy and ennobling their influence had been. "I can think of no higher profession," she went on, her voice warming a little from its habitual lifelessness, "and it is a profession to which I have always been brought up. The first duty of any English prince or princess is to support the throne, and I hope I have always been conscious of my duty. But it goes beyond duty with your highness, I think." She stilled, and shot me a rather piercing look with those china blue eyes. I knew that she felt the impropriety of such a conversation with her maid. Yet, who else might have asked her such questions? "Yes," she said after a moment, very softly. "I work very hard as Mama's secretary, but I have always considered myself capable of greater things. It does weary me to spend so much of my time in futile, frivolous, time-wasting things. As queen I should feel myself employed in a truly useful occupation." "Then allow me to wish you felicity, ma'am." For the first time a glimmer of humor showed in those cool eyes. "And I shall be happy to accept those felicitations, Sharp, if only Eddie can be brought up to scratch." Chapter 6. So far, this memoir of mine has been a trifling affair, with little of moment to record. There have been no desperate journeys, no romantic last stands, not even a declaration of love, or the smallest domestic tragedy. As I take up my pen to record the next chapter, however, I find myself getting up from my writing desk and taking a turn about the room. I think I will put the kettle on to boil, or wander outside for a look at the magpie that is singing outside my window. Time has softened the memories, but now I must unearth those dreadful remains, and bring them back into the light as ghastly as ever they were in the moment. The text spent a quiet evening, much of which I passed with Princess May in her sitting room, reading aloud to her from a novel. I remember it very well. It was Framley Parsonage. Before turning in at 11, I was eating breakfast the next morning in the servants' hall when one of the housemaids came down to give me a letter, which at a glance I saw was from Sal, and to tell me I was wanted in the library by the Duke of Teck and a policeman. "Looks like they've come for you already," snickered one of the footmen who had just been reading from the morning's papers with ghoulish pleasure an account of a grisly murder in Whitechapel. Looks can be deceiving, I said, wiping my mouth and putting the letter in my pocket. From your looks I thought you might have been a nice young man, Henry Higginbotham, but I hope I have the grace to admit when I am wrong. All the same, I made my way upstairs to the library in some perturbation. Had not thought the Duke of Schleswig-Holstein the sort of man to go to the police. He occupied a vastly higher sphere, surely, so what did it mean if he had? Was I about to be arrested? Or had I attracted the attention of the police in some other way since leaving St. Botolph's yesterday? The Duke of Teck was waiting in the library next to a very tall, very thin man, in plain clothes consisting of a caped greatcoat, smelling faintly of tobacco, and a bowler hat, which he was twiddling between long fingers. The policeman's face was clean-shaven, narrow and rather nice, with eyes and a thin mouth that turned down a little at the outer corners, making him look slightly anxious. He struck me as being the sort of person who cared a great deal about a great many things and couldn't seem to stop himself. The Duke was an upright, handsome man with a very straight nose, a very stiff collar, and a very large, swooping mustache waxed very stiffly at the points. He seemed relieved to see me. "Air Sharp? This is Alexander Short of Scotland Yard. He wants you to assist in his inquiries." "I'll leave you to it, Short." "Thank you, Your Highness." "It's Serene Highness, if you please. And don't thank me, I'm just happy it isn't about my wife's debts. Demmed creditors hound a man day and night, and—" He made himself as scarce as the hair on his head. The plainclothes man, who had been looking at my scars without saying anything, handed me a card. "Inspector Short," he said unnecessarily. I craned my neck to look up at him, and found that he was hunched over slightly to avoid the chandelier. "You can get that name changed down at the Old Bailey for 10 bob, you know." His pained expression only became slightly more pained. "Special branch," he added. That took all the wind out of my sails. Special branch was practically the only branch of the force we had learned anything about. It was the one that looked after the interests of the Empire abroad, while at home it saw to the anarchist fugitives, many of them continental, who congregated in the narrow alleys of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Had Duke Ernst Gunther reported me as an anarchist? All this went through my mind between one word and the next before Short's next words froze my blood. "I'm afraid you must prepare yourself for some bad news, Miss Sharp. In the early hours of this morning, a body was discovered in a dark corner of Cox's Square in Whitechapel. She has been identified as a former inmate of St. Botolph's Hospital." "For the love of God, who?" "Sarah Tanner." "Sal," I said faintly. Short took me by the elbow and guided me to an armchair. I fell into the seat and sat there, staring at a small china dog on the hearth without really seeing it. "What happened to her?" I heard myself asking after a moment. "It wasn't a pretty sight, Miss Sharp." "I must know. Tell me how she died." There was a moment's silence before he said dispassionately, "There were a great many lacerations on the face, the breast, and the forearms, consistent with defense wounds. There were signs of a struggle, so it seems that she put up a fight. The cause of death was a gash across the throat, severing artery and windpipe." "Shall I stop?" "No, please go on. The medical evidence at present favors a single assailant wielding a blunted knife. The body was identified this morning by Clara Scrimson, the director of St. Botolph's Hospital, and I've already visited the hospital to verify her story against the records." Only half paying attention, I reached into my pocket and drew out the letter I had received that morning, a square of folded white paper addressed to myself. At the White Lodge. The wax seal was unbroken, but there was something hard and heavy inside. It was postmarked Aldgate, and a second glance at the address banished all doubt. "I received this from her this morning." "From whom?" "From Sal." I smoothed my thumbs over the letter, not daring to open it. If I read it, it would be the last I should ever hear of my friend, and then she really would be dead. "May I?" He held out his hand for the letter, and I had no choice but to surrender it. "You left St. Botolph's yesterday morning, I believe." "Yes." "Then this was likely written within 24 hours of her death." He returned it with a slight bow, having done no more than frown at the postmark. "I should like to know what is in this letter, Miss Sharp." You don't want to open it yourself? It's against the law to tamper with Her Majesty's mail. It's addressed to you. I didn't know the law still applied in cases of murder investigations, I said tiredly. I don't know why it mattered to me except that it was better, presently, to focus on smaller relevant things. I shall rely on you to forward the letter to me once you have read it, Miss Sharp. He extracted a notebook and a pencil stub from his pocket. Now then, your full name and age. Elizabeth Sharp, age unknown. How long have you known the deceased? About 2 years, yes, 2 years come February. I understand that Miss Tanner arrived at St. Botolph shortly after. Yourself? Yes, you can tell by our names. We were assigned names alphabetically. Robinson, Sharp, Tanner, and so on. Did Miss Tanner ever refer to her life before St. Botolph's? Of course not. We none of us could remember our lives before St. Botolph's. I had to ask Miss Sharp, can you tell me who Miss Tanner's most intimate friends were? I thought of all the girls who gathered at night to learn in whispers what Sal had to teach them about the royalties of Europe, their dread power, and their jealously guarded weaknesses, the silver bullets, the wolfsbane, the poppy juice, and the incendiary bombs. A list of Sal's most intimate friends would be a list of the St. Botolph's girls who intended not to be found helpless a second time, and I did not like to bring them to the attention of the police. I was her most intimate friend. As for the others, she must have been intimate to some extent with all of them, living together as we did. Did she have any enemies? Where? Among the girls? Anywhere, Miss Sharp. Until this morning, I would never have dreamed that Sal had enemies. She was a quiet girl. She listened more often than she spoke, and she liked to help people. I thought we all liked her. I am told that she was often permitted to leave the hospital. Sal was very good at putting up a pretense of docility, and unlike myself, she was perpetually on Miss Scrimson's good side. Otherwise, the director might have been my first suspect. Yes, about once a week. Where did she go on these occasions? To the free library on the Whitechapel Road. She was a great reader, unlike myself, which was how she had become our teacher. Did Miss Tanner go anywhere else on any of these occasions? Well, she only had permission to visit the library. I appreciate that, but as neither of you can now fall afoul of Miss Scrimson, I must insist upon an answer. I'm not trying to hoax you. Sal went to the library every week for 3 hours on a Saturday afternoon. She would tell me about the things she had read. What did she read? History mostly. Sal poured through history book after history book, reading everything she could find about the continental royalties, and passing on to us the tidbits of information, gossip, and conjecture she found there. Naturally, their various conditions were not secret, but just as naturally, the monster seemed reluctant to allow any systematic description of their powers and weaknesses to be written. Since a free press was then virtually unknown on the continent, this was not very difficult for them to accomplish. And as far as you know, she had no acquaintances beyond St. Botolph's? Not unless she was in the habit of speaking to the librarian. The suspicion was growing in my mind. Special branch deals with anarchists, doesn't it? He put down his pencil and looked at me through those slightly drooping eyes, and his thin mouth pulled just a little thinner and tighter. Now I wonder why you asked that question, Miss Sharp. Had I given myself away? At St. Botolph's we were told to be always on the lookout for anarchists, Inspector. Indeed, a large part of our education was directed towards identifying, foiling, and capturing such people. Now my friend is dead, and I am being questioned by an inspector from Special Branch. Naturally, I asked that question. His eyes narrowed. What was Sal doing in Cox's Square at midnight? I asked abruptly. I did hope you might have answered that question. How would you have described Miss Tanner's character? I understand St. Botolph's caters to fallen women. It was a polite euphemism to mask an ugly allegation. I don't believe she was a prostitute, if that's what you mean. I beg your pardon, Miss Sharp, but when a woman finds herself alone with a strange man at night, anything might have happened, I said passionately. All of us at St. Botolph's eventually found ourselves out at night, alone with strangers. That's why I have these scars. Why are you so very sure it could never happen to you? I mean no disrespect. Desperate people do desperate things. If I was starving, I am sure I should be tempted to fill myself at the cost of my principles. And there you have it. Sal wasn't desperate. We might not have been particularly happy or comfortable at St. Botolph's, but at least we had food and beds there, and a hope of finding honest work in the future if we could only get through the present. Short looked at me strangely. Yesterday afternoon, not long after your own departure, Miss Tanner left St. Botolph's declaring that she would never return. Were you aware that she intended to do this? Not in the least. What, leave St. Botolph's? Without finding a position? Without a word to me. I accompanied Miss Scrimson to the hospital and examined the records myself. They bore out her testimony perfectly. She had no time to fake them if you want to know. It was comforting somehow to know that he was at least as suspicious of Miss Scrimson as he was of me. I focused on that thought in preference to thinking how Sal, quiet, studious, unoffending Sal, must have died, alone and terrified, and fighting for her life in a Whitechapel Square. Huskily I said, "Oh, Sal. Her departure was unpremeditated, then?" "It must have been." "What did Miss Scrimson say about it?" "As little as possible." He frowned. "I have men inquiring at the Doss houses to see if Miss Tanner had attempted to secure a bed for the night, but I am afraid it seems as though she had, sought the protection of a stranger." He stood up, putting his pencil and notebook back in his pocket. After a moment he put out his hand. "Thank you for answering my questions, Miss Sharp. I'm truly sorry to have been the bearer of such bad news." I realized he was waiting for me to shake his hand. It occurred to me that in the 2 years since I had received my scars, only my fellow inmates had ever touched me of their own will. My voice was husky as I said, "Thank you for coming." He had said terrible things about Sal, but at least he had cared. "Bring me the letter when you have read it. My card will tell you where to find me." "I will," I promised, but I was dissatisfied with the interview. If I had fenced, so had he. Do you think an anarchist might have had something to do with it then? He paused at the door, still twiddling his hat with those long, clever fingers. "It's too early to say, Miss Sharp. Whitechapel sees a great many murders like this, I'm afraid. Good day." The door closed behind him and I sat in the armchair with the card in one hand and Sal's letter in the other, staring at both without seeing them. Oh, Sal. Chapter 7. Eventually Mrs. Leacock sent Molly to fetch me. Her knock and timid call, "Are you well, Miss Sharp?" found me lying on the bed in my tiny room staring at the ceiling without really seeing it. Hastily I cleared my throat and wiped my face. "I've just had some very bad news, Molly. Her Highness has been ringing for you these 10 minutes. "Thank you. I'll be there directly." I sat up, feeling about as ancient as Methuselah, and peered into the small mirror. The face within was very pale and sad, but the redness had passed off. The sight nearly made me burst into tears again, but I pulled myself together, splashed myself with cold water and smoothed my hair back. Sal's letter lay on the bed, still unopened. A quarter of an hour ago I could not have seen to read it, even if I had wished to. I swept it and the card up and tucked them safely into my pocket before setting out into the house. I found Princess May in her small room, surrounded by satin dresses in white, gray and lavender. "Oh, Sharp, there you are." "I beg your pardon, ma'am. Is something the matter?" "Yes," I said, taking a deep, careful breath. "My friend died. She was murdered." "Oh, how terribly sad. I am sorry." She paused an awkward moment, then handed me a spool of lace. "There's another party at Marlborough House tonight, and I've cycled through all my evening frocks twice in the last 2 months. There's nothing for it but to try to disguise one of them and hope it works. What about this one?" I forced all thoughts of Sal away from my mind, and saw at once that May had made the right choice. The dress was pearl gray satin, its bodice nipping to a wasp waist before sweeping out in a bell-shaped skirt, with a low straight décolletage and tiny cap sleeves. It was almost severely simple. One simple and well-chosen alteration could transform its mood completely. I held the lace against the pearl gray satin and nodded. "Would you like me to gather it up and add it as a ruffle to the neck and shoulders? Would that be difficult?" "No, not in the least." "Oh, Sharp, thank you. It's high time Eddie proposed, and everyone is depending on me. Not that Eddie would notice the dress, I expect. But Aunt Alexandra certainly would, and I don't wish her to think I don't try." She looked down at her tightly interlaced fingers. Her voice sank. "Murdered, did you say?" I'm afraid so. I had thought she was going to ignore what I had said. Certainly she had no words of comfort to give. At the time it was hard that she said so little, but now looking back I understand her a little better. I was to learn that Princess May was not merely reserved, but shy, and such things were entirely beyond her experience. She was too honest to pretend to know how a sufferer felt. Presently she said stiffly, I am nobody, I know, but if there is anything I can do to help, you have only to say the word and I will do what I can. I might probably need to visit Scotland Yard, as the person who did it is still at large. Is he? She was by nature too phlegmatic to respond strongly, but the tip of her nose whitened a little. Sharp, you are to have all the time you need to assist the police. Tell Kitchener you shall have the use of the dog-cart to take you to the train. I thanked her and we parted, she to the green corridor to take care of her mother's charitable business, which took up nearly every spare moment, and I to the servants' hall to begin gathering and ruffling the lace and stitching it to the dress with tiny invisible stitches. The job was a protracted one, requiring a little preparatory work, removing a trimming from the existing garment, but it did not occupy much of my mind. To distract myself I spoke to the Duke's valet, and learned that he was a Tory with very decided views on Russia's movements in the Pamirs. I knew very little about Russia, and the Pamirs might have been in Africa for all I then knew, but for me the thrill of debate has always been an end in itself. At the end of 3 hours picking holes in his reasoning, the valet was exhausted. Mrs. Blackmore was ready to murder us, and I was myself again. I laid the pearl grey satin on Princess May's bed and stood back to admire my handiwork. I didn't know May's Aunt Alexandra well enough to know if the alteration would fool her, but the addition of the lace certainly changed the mood of the whole garment and made the grey satin seem a little more silvery. I must try to convince May to wear diamonds with it, rather than pearls. She might prefer the latter, but they were too staid for the occasion. No matter what Short said, I knew my friend Sal was alone in the street at night because she had left St. Botolph's and had nowhere else to go, not because she was plying a horrible trade in her own flesh or blood. Until the thought surfaced from the aching turmoil of my mind, I had barely known what to think of Short's hypothesis. He had seemed so very sure of himself. In retrospect, the idea was absurd. It was true that a desperate person might do desperate things, and of course no matter what Sal might have done, out of desperation or otherwise, she had not deserved to be murdered, but all the same, she was only hours out of St. Botolph's and could not have been quite as desperate as that. I turned away from the dress, drawn to the window that looked out onto the lawn where Eddie and May had sat at tea the previous afternoon, and stood there with my arms folded, looking without seeing. Why did Sal leave St. Botolph's so suddenly, without securing a job? I could not believe it was premeditated. There must have been a quarrel. Miss Scrimson was hiding something, but there were plenty of girls at St. Botolph's who might know something of the truth, and who would speak to me if I asked them in a way they might not speak to a policeman. And then Sal was not desperate, not even for protection, especially not for protection. I whistled as the thought struck me. If it had taken so long to occur to me, then Short, who found it so difficult to believe in 24 amnesiacs whose memories did not reach more than 2 or 3 years into the past, might have overlooked the fact altogether. Sal was stronger than most men, stronger than any of the rest of us. Most of us had fallen victim to werewolves. One, who now hoped to become an opera singer, had nearly been drowned by a siren. Sal, the only one of us who had fallen prey to a vampire, was strong, lithe, and quick as lightning. She was not likely to be overcome by any single assailant, and Short said there had been a single assailant and that she had died with a struggle. If that was true, it could only mean one thing. My scalp prickled, the hair stood on end, and I had put my hand into my pocket to fetch out the letter, when the door opened and May entered to be dressed for the evening's festivities.